Today we're diving into one of the most consequential but least understood tools in America's economic security arsenal, export controls. Why do export controls matter for protecting America's technology edge and national security? How have these tools evolved amid growing threats from competitors and adversaries? And what are the trade-offs for U.S. industry, for innovation, for U.S. technology leadership? To answer these questions and more, we're joined by Matt Borman, former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Bureau of Industry and Security in the Commerce Department, one of our nation's foremost experts in this topic. I'm Navin Girishankar, your host of Betting on America. Matt Borman, welcome to CSIS. I should say that I'm a big fan of yours. We were former colleagues in the Commerce Department. I was privileged to see you in action. And I'm now privileged that you are an affiliate of CSIS. You had served under 6 presidents over your career at BIS, and this is a really delightful opportunity for us to hear from you as you step back and take a look at the broad expanse of your career, and importantly, the evolution of America's export control tools. So welcome.
Navin, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It was great working with you at the Department of Commerce, and I'm delighted to be affiliated with CSIS and here to talk about export controls. And if I could, maybe a couple framers. Often when you say export controls, people have no idea what that means. So often we use the term strategic trade, which sometimes makes it a little easier for people who are outside the Beltway to understand. Mm-hmm. And then one other thing I think it's really important to know is that we at least try not to think of this as a balance between national security and economic, because you're really advancing both.
Excellent.
So just a couple framers on that.
That's a great framer. So now, with that in mind, take us back before we go forward. Take us back several decades. How has this tool evolved through the course of America's economic policy history, its uses, its goals, and how has the Department of Commerce really evolved in its usage of this tool?
So if you'll indulge me a little bit, I'll go back maybe centuries.
Yes, let's do it.
At least the first example of export controls that I'm aware of was the Byzantine Empire tried to make sure that its adversaries did not get Greek fire. Mm-hmm. Now, in today's world, we'd probably say that was a U.S. munitions list item, not a dual-use item, because I'm not sure that there were commercial applications for Greek fire. But then galloping a few centuries forward, when the U.S. was a British colony, the British tried to restrict the export of timber from New Hampshire to reserve it all for the British naval fleet. Mm-hmm. And of course, the good citizens of New Hampshire tried to get around that because they thought they could make more money selling it elsewhere. Then again, come forward to the late 1930s. Because of China's aggression in China, the Roosevelt administration put restrictions on key raw materials. Japan's aggression in China, against China, on oil, scrap metal, and the like. And the Japanese actually cited that as a pretext for attacking Pearl Harbor. Now, you know, that obviously was a pretext. Then, of course, after the end of World War II and the Cold War, the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, COCOM, was stood up. And it was essentially the trade equivalent of, or parallel to NATO, that all the essentially NATO members would agree on what kind of technology should not be allowed to go to the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries. Yeah. Then, of course, after the end of the Soviet Union, in the 1990s, and this is in the Clinton administration, COCOM ended, and there was a lot of work to set up the successor called the Vasanar arrangement, which is named after a town in Holland, coincidentally is where the U.S. Embassy is located now. This really still covers what you might call industrial goods. Now, of course, instead of machine tools to cut heavy pieces of metal, what's now most significant are tools to make semiconductors, the semiconductors themselves, and so on. So you've had that sort of evolution up to this point. Of course, now what you have is the rise of China as a technological competitor and the implications that raises. And that takes you kind of right to the end of the Biden administration, then into the Trump administration.
Yeah, that's fascinating history. Now, a couple of things to spend a minute on. On Vasanar, Russia is part of that. So give us a little bit of color on the issues that have obviously clearly emerged around that.
So, back in the 1990s, when Vasanar was being stood up, there was a lot of discussion among the allies, the COCOM allies, essentially, on whether to have Russia in or out. It was decided that it was better to have Russia in, Ukraine as well, Belarus as well. And of course, Vasanar operates by consensus. So any changes to the controls, particularly adding new controls like emerging technologies, all the members have to agree. And if folks look at what Vasanar has agreed to over the last few years, particularly since February of 2022, there are no more emerging new controls being added. And you can conclude from that that at least one member is not agreeing to that. And so this has driven some of the allies to think about how to address that. And one of the things, again, you'll see publicly is that, for example, in quantum technology, the U.S. and other key quantum stakeholders or technology holders have done their own controls. It's sort of a unilateral, plurilateral controls. And the U.S. did theirs in December of 2024.
So a kind of coalitions of the willing emerging to solve for the geopolitical realities we're in.
That's right.
The other reality is that unlike COCOM, now we're in a world in which our competitors, let's say like China, are in global value chains. They're in global markets. They're fully integrated. And so it's not decoupled, not yet, not decoupled. And so it really raises questions when you talk about strategic trade, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes, no, absolutely. And, from an export control or strategic trade point of view, the ideal time to put controls in place is when they're beyond fundamental research but not widely commercialized. Once they're widely commercialized and in the global value chains, then it becomes much more complicated. Because not only do you have to get all the suppliers on board or figure out how to do it unilaterally with extraterritorial controls, you've got a lot more commercial interest, right?
Yeah.
And it's very, very challenging, particularly in some of these high-tech areas where you effectively have almost state champions, even in market economies. You'll have companies that are clearly the biggest employer, the biggest market cap, and so on in their particular jurisdictions. And so that makes it very challenging politically for jurisdictions, including the United States, to be very restrictive on them, especially when China is such a big market.
Yeah, it's really interesting because value chains are evolving so quickly. Global markets are evolving so quickly. So it's not just the technology that's advancing. It's also understanding market conditions because if I understand it correctly, the effectiveness of export controls, the leverage one gets from that depends in part on your market share.
Yes, that's right. And so, again, from a strategic trade point of view, when there's only companies in the United States, for example, that are clearly the tech leaders, from one perspective, that makes it an attractive target for controls because you're probably going to be more effective. But it also means you may be impacting their ability to continue to be the technology leaders.
Yeah.
So again, it's not again, we never thought of it as a balance. You're really trying to advance both keeping the technologies that you need to keep from the adversaries or potential adversaries, but doing it in a way that doesn't undercut the U.S. companies and the allied companies to a lesser extent, technology leadership.
Okay. So let me take a couple of things, because I just want to make sure the audience who may have different levels of a familiarity with this really have a good base of understanding. Just walk through one technology and just explain to me, how does the export control regime work? Like, take it from soup to nuts. Like, how does that work, and what does success look like in one technology area?
Yeah. So I'll use quantum as one example, since those are relatively recent. First step is to identify what are the key enablers, the technology enablers. Is it an end item and or key components? And the way the export control system is structured is typically once you decide what commodity needs to be restricted in some way, imposing export license requirements, the software and technology to develop, produce, and use that item is also controlled.
Yeah.
So step one is, what is the thing that really needs to be controlled? Then step two, ideally, is who makes it, and especially are there sources outside the United States? Because if there are, again, to be effective, you really either need to get those jurisdictions to impose comparable controls, or you decide, can you reach them extraterritorially? And you've seen an increase in that starting at the end of Trump 1 with Huawei, but then coming through the Biden administration, where because virtually every technology of significance has a semiconductor in it, and almost all semiconductors are in some way based on U.S. software or technology and produced on a line with a U.S. tool, that's the extraterritorial hook. Now, the risk is if you do too much of that, you really are incentivizing design out. And in the semiconductor space, that's probably not a short-term issue, but it's certainly something that should be ideally factored in when these controls are being contemplated.
Okay, explain that a little bit, design out.
So if you are a foreign business and you are sourcing inputs, components, parts, from a U.S. supplier that's subject to export controls, and now you know that your product that you're making outside the United States, looking to sell to a third country, could be subject to U.S. restrictions, not just your own government's, but U.S. restrictions. At some point, you might decide, I'll revise my supply chain and get suppliers who can give me those comparable components that are not subject, and therefore get out of even the U.S. extraterritorial controls.
Yes, okay. A hugely important point.
Yes.
So thank you for walking us through that. I want to come back to a topic later on today, which is really the capacity that's needed to be able to enforce this and just understand what's happening in the markets, which is really raises the bar for folks who do the work that you used to do in government. Could you speak a little bit about that, and we'll come back to your forward-looking recommendations there.
So particularly as controls are more focused on what's happening outside the United States, so not just direct exports, U.S. to another country, but something produced outside the United States, again, with U.S. content or based on U.S. software and technology, that really puts a lot more priority on both the analytical capability to look at trends, and this is what's been happening with looking at the Russia trade restrictions, because a lot of those Western-labeled components that are still showing up in Russian weapon systems are not made in the United States. They are subject to controls, but as you can imagine, that's a real challenge to make sure, especially with distributors and global supply chains, how do you make sure those things don't leak into Russia? So you need the analytical capability, both the individuals with expertise and also the tools, the data tools. And then you certainly need, on the enforcement side, to have the resources so that you can identify and prosecute. But the enforcement is almost always a whack-a-mole in a way, right? So you need both the analytical capability, systematic capability, as well as the specific capability.
So this is great. You've helped us understand the sophistication of this enterprise has evolved significantly. It was already complex 30, 40 years ago, but it has become all the more complex and nuanced. And so then the question I would have is, can you highlight a couple of important inflection points, particularly in the last few years, where the the United States use of export controls has expanded dramatically. So tell us why that's happened. Give us a couple of these inflection points so we get a sense of where we are right now.
Yeah, so I'll give a couple examples. When I started in the Bureau, early 2000, there was already a licensing practice for semiconductor tools going to China that of trying to keep China 2 generations behind in terms of technology node. That's something that's clearly evolved to a much more public stated policy in the Biden administration in particular. And of course, there the challenge is you have some very key suppliers that are not U.S. And so how do you go about convincing the other supplier governments that this is a national security issue? So that's one type of inflection point. Another is this plurilateral effort with the relevant multilateral export control regimes are stuck. How do you still make sure you address the emerging technologies? And then certainly this extraterritorial, going the foreign direct product rule, which essentially means if you have a product made abroad and it has a U.S. content, particularly a semiconductor, that we, by regulation, now control. The other dimension, of course, are the countries. So, one of the dramatic changes that occurred, that I've seen occur during my time is India. right? After India tested its nuclear weapon, they were close to an embargoed country. I mean, there was like 25% of all U.S. exports to India at that time needed a license, which is extraordinary for a non-embargoed country. And then in the Bush II administration, and then carrying forward into the Obama administration, dramatic reset in that relationship. So that's an example of a country. Other countries, of course, might have gone the other way. Obviously, Syria restrictions were quite extensive, essentially an embargoed country, although apparently that may change now. So you've got those two kind of dimensions. And then, with Russia, getting, almost 40 other countries to impose comparable trade restrictions on Russia outside of a formal treaty or regime, a big inflection point. So I think
Huge.
you've got
and that was in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Exactly.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about this.
Yeah, so as the Russians had 150,000 troops massed on the Ukrainian border back at the end of 2021 into early 2022, we in the U.S. government had already prepared trade restrictions, extensive trade restrictions in the event that they were going to invade. And then we were able to talk to particularly the European Commission team and the key member states so that when that initial invasion unfortunately occurred, or resumed invasion, I should say, the EU was already with a very extensive set of restrictions that were very close to ours. And it was really taking the U.S. export control structure, which is the multilaterally controlled items which were already controlled, licensing policy essentially of denial to Russia, but then the next strata of technologies, which in the U.S. system are called anti-terrorism controls. The EU calls them advanced technology controls, but getting, working with them so they understood what the breadth of that was so that they could craft their own restrictions. And then, of course, the British did something similar, the Japanese, Koreans, and some of the other key governments.
I must say, you're probably too modest to say this, but I remember trying to rally 38, 40 countries while you were doing this, sleepless nights. It was not. It was a non-trivial effort on the part of the U.S. and your team.
Yeah.
And just now, I just want to do one more thing. What were the things that you were putting controls on with respect to the Russians?
So close to almost any technology, if you will, going to Russia. So not just the highest end semiconductors, but all semiconductors.
Right.
Not just the highest, most sophisticated machine tools, but all machine tools. Not just the most advanced jet engines, but all jet engines, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Because all of that could contribute to Russia's war effort.
So there was another big thing that happened over the last few years, which is, I remember a couple of dates, October 2022, October 2023, and that's with respect to these advanced technologies. Tell us a little bit more about those, because that was also an important inflection point in recent years.
Right, yeah. So, over the last some years, there's, of course, been a real rise in the prominence of GPUs, graphic processing units, for artificial intelligence, and with ChatGPT and those kinds of apps. There was a real realization that these were things that were no longer just for gaming systems and had some strategic significance. So starting in October 2022, the U.S. put controls on those most advanced chips. And again, because a lot of those, well, frankly, all those chips virtually are made outside the United States, designed in the United States, but produced outside. Not only have the control level to control those chips, essentially leaving the U.S., say going to China, but also when they're produced outside the United States. So that was one of the real expansions of the foreign direct product rule, because those would not be effective without that. Also, more controls on the tools that are most critical for making those advanced chips. So those two pieces to it. And then, of course, those have to be refined because the technology is accelerating and the markets are evolving, and the countries that seek to get them, that we don't want them to get them, are always looking for ways around it. So that's why you had this more or less annual, over the last 3 years, revisions of the controls, both in terms of the technical control parameters as well as sort of the scoping of this.
And then the administration, the Biden administration, sort of came to an end with kind of a few other controls that they kind of put out there, the AI diffusion rule. Could you give us the high level on that?
Sure.
Because it's popped up again for
Yes.
in recent weeks. So just let's start with what the Biden administration put in place.
Yeah. So I'm going to step back just to December 2024 to again
Yeah.
emphasize that rule was significant, but because it put the controls on these quantum choke point technologies and some other ones, including certain semiconductor design technology.
Yeah.
And that was actually after some of the key allies had already put their comparable controls in place. So you have that. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the last week of the Biden administration, 3 very significant rules were done. This AI diffusion rule, a rule we called foundry due diligence, and then one on some key biotechnology equipment. The AI diffusion rule, the policy behind that was to further ensure that China was not able to get these restricted chips through third countries, but also so that China couldn't access that compute capability in a third country. And so that was the country, there was certain country groupings, the most favorable, mid-favorable,
tiers,
unfavorable, the country tiers, and country caps, so volumes, because I think there was also a concern that we didn't want foreign countries to have more compute capability ultimately than we did, than the United States did. Now, the Trump administration has now come out, of course, and said, we've rescinded that rule. We're going to replace it with something else that's to be determined what that will be.
Right.
But that's, and I think the policy goals are basically still the same, which is U.S., making sure the adversaries don't get access to the compute power by getting the chips directly or through a third country chips or access to the compute power, but also making sure that U.S. companies continue to be the technology leaders.
Yes.
And essentially making sure that countries that are interested in this capability buy U.S. rather than the alternative.
I'm so glad you raised that, because this is the trade-off. And, different administrations come down in different ways on this, but this is ultimately what we have to figure out. How do we ensure preeminence, leadership, expansion of markets, yet at the same time not letting these fall in the hands of adversaries that would use them for various purposes, including dual-use purposes. Do I have that right?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And of course, in this case, the vast majority of uses for these chips and the AI are very legitimate civilian, commercial.
Yeah.
But the challenge is they also have very significant national security implications. And for countries that we are concerned about, we want to make sure that they're as limited as possible from getting to that place.
So this is where I wanted to pivot to the U.S. industry perspective, because obviously I can imagine there's no way you could have done your job without close interactions with U.S. companies, technology companies, U.S. industries, semiconductor manufacturing equipment suppliers of various sorts. But you hear a number of arguments, counter arguments. One is that, I'm going to give a couple of them, and some of our own scholars have opined on this, so I just wanted to get your reactions to it and to help us think about this well. One argument is that, well, export controls obviously limit U.S. companies from exporting to certain markets, China, for example, which is a revenue hit for them. It is also a disincentive for them to innovate, because you can't plow back those revenues into R&D and then really push the envelope in terms of innovation. So especially with very large markets, that's a disincentive. That's one argument. Let me give you another one and then get your reaction. The other one is that export controls on China, for example, provide a very strong incentive for them to accelerate indigenization or the development of their own capabilities when it comes to chips. And you see a number of examples around this. So I just want to get your reactions to those two arguments as someone who was the steward of U.S. export control policy.
Yeah, as is usually the answer in this space, the answer is yes and yes or no and no. I mean, there's validity to both perspectives. First, let me start with the last. I mean, it's clear that China has a self-sufficiency drive. If you look at the much vaunted Made in China 2025 program.
Which predated these rules.
Which predated, yes, right. And frankly, whenever we used to have, and still even the Biden administration had some bilateral export control discussions with the Chinese, this is the issue they are always raising. Why are you holding us back? Why are you restricting us? from this kind of technology. So I think that that's certainly true. Now, the more difficult it is for them to get the highest end technologies, of course, that's going to spur that, and you see that in all the investments, the big fund and so on. But so again, I don't know that that's a reason not to do the controls. The challenge is to calibrate them so that, again, you're really focusing on what matters and what can be effectively controlled, because I think that's the way you ensure that the U.S. and, frankly, other Western tech leaders can continue to stay at the top of the tech stack, if you will.
Yeah.
But that requires, a lot of analysis, a lot of thinking about what are the collateral consequences,
right,
because it's relatively easy to put controls in place. What's much harder to do is two things. One is make sure you feel like you've anticipated all the potential consequences, both in terms of impact on technology leadership, but also in retaliation. And then be able to monitor what's happening in as real time as possible so that you're not looking at things after the fact. In the export control space, people often talk about machine tools. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, the U.S. was the world's leader in machine tools. And part of that was because a lot of the competitors' capacity was destroyed in World War II.
right.
But there are folks who say that this current state of the U.S. machine tool industry, not the semiconductor tools, but the metal cutters, if you will, it's a fraction of what it used to be. And there are many reasons for that, but certainly people in the industry will tell you one of it was because of too restrictive export controls, which both led foreign allied competitors to step into that, and then eventually China as well, for example. A contra-example is perhaps encryption, what we call encryption. 30 years ago, it was a U.S. munitions item, restricted, needed a license worldwide. And folks had the foresight in the Clinton administration to realize this was going to be a huge commercial market and technology, and then they engineered the transfer of that jurisdiction from an export control viewpoint from state to commerce with, hopefully the appropriate restrictions. And so, of course, now U.S. companies are not the only ones, but they're certainly among the market leaders in this. And that technology was going to develop regardless of whether the U.S. was restrictive or not.
Yeah.
And so there's an example where I think controls were generally calibrated pretty well to do both, to keep those technologies that matter the most from the parties that we would not want them to get, but allow U.S. companies to flourish.
It's really interesting because it requires so much nuance in doing this well. But there's something, I just want to pull this thread and see if it makes sense. While there are different perspectives on does it motivate innovation or acceleration on the part of competitors? Does it hinder our companies and our innovation? But there is something in between, which is it buys time.
Yes.
Right? Like, in a sense, you could take different points of view, but still agree that it buys time, right?
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. No, I think that's something that's very important for everybody in this space to understand is I can think of any situation where a country cannot develop a technology, I would say a reasonably advanced, sophisticated country like China, but even the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union figured out how, in part, to do an atomic weapon. I mean, they got it in part because of essentially violation of export controls, if you will. But also, there's a lot of very smart scientists and engineers. So I think that's key for people to understand. It's really continuing to race faster, run ahead. And so you really need the promote side of that equation to go along with the protect side of the equation.
Yeah. You're saying something here that I just want to make sure we underscore, that it's important not to look at these tools in isolation.
Yes.
Like the beauty of the Commerce Department, which I learned having the opportunity to serve, is that it has many tools that it could integrate effectively in an economic security kind of strategy or toolkit that covers the promote side, the protect side, the partner side, and which is kind of what you did through your career.
Right.
But is that something we should be moving towards more, which is the integration of these tools across U.S. government?
Yes. So to start with, I think people need to understand that export controls is a tool. It's not a strategy. And I think sometimes people gravitate toward it as a strategy. And again, the ideal thing is you really, within the Commerce Department, for example, but then across the executive branch, really have all the expertise that brought to bear. And then coming back to your point about industry engagement, industry engagement is critical because my perspective is that, responsible U.S. companies, particularly those that are publicly traded, when you say to them, here is our national security concern, we are looking to do something that's effective, which means it keeps that technology from the adversary but doesn't undercut U.S. leadership. We need your input. It doesn't mean we'll always just do whatever an industry suggests, but they usually are quite good about that. And they certainly would say, yes, we make X thing, and if you control that or restrict that, you will buy time, and here's the other foreign players that you would also need to get restricted. Because at the end of the day, most U.S. companies are not focused on just losing revenue. The key for them is losing revenue to foreign competitors. That's what really hurts them. And ultimately, the worst case scenario is when you see those products coming into the United States. It's one thing you're losing market share, say, in China, and those foreign companies are reinvesting and moving up the technology stack or moving ahead. But then the worst scenario is, I think, then those products are coming into the United States and competing with products that are made here.
That is such a balanced perspective. I'm so glad you're sharing this because it underscores the importance of those close interactions with the private sector to understand the situation. And two, to also understand why other allies are needed for export controls. And that coordination with them is important as well.
And if I could just pull on that thread a little bit. Again, there are any number of technologies that we, the U.S., can control extraterritorially. But as I mentioned before, that puts a real strain on how do you monitor and enforce those, because by definition, these are things happening outside the United States. And so I think generally speaking, if you can get the foreign government to put those controls in place, one, they own the control, and two, they're on the ground, if you will. And as long as you have appropriate information sharing and coordination, which is another, I would say, inflection point that has started and ideally will continue, much more regular ongoing information sharing among key allies on these coordinated controls, that's one of the elements you really need for them to be effective.
A huge point. And it's just to understand how much time is spent with allies in the design and implementation of these things is something that is hard to underestimate. You obviously live that every day, but I just wanted to put an exclamation point on that. So then let me bring us to the trade war topic, which is we're in the midst of a multi-front tariff war, trade war. There are negotiations, hopefully a pathway to rebalancing of some sort. They're at different stages. But it raises a question about the role of export controls in the context of those negotiations. Because what the Trump administration has done, for good reason, is to say, we're not just going to negotiate tariffs. This is a leverage point to talk about many other things that are longstanding issues, non-tariff barriers, defense umbrella, other sorts of things, right? Now, export controls could be part of those negotiations. So in one sense, you could say export controls are like non-negotiable. The reason we're doing this is because of national security, economic security issues. On the other hand, they may be part of a negotiation. How should we think about this, and what are the risks?
So I think from public statements, it seems that the Trump administration is looking to look at these kind of as packages, and sort of the non-tariff issues certainly could include export controls. I think there you've got some significant challenges in that if another country says, either we don't have the legal authority to do everything that you're doing, or we don't have the political will, can we nonetheless restrict through extraterritorial? And I think that requires some really careful analysis, and it's sort of a technology by technology basis almost. You also potentially have a risk that as part of the ultimate package, the starting point for U.S. Requirements, if you will, for a foreign negotiating partner for export controls come out to be less than they started with. Now, having said that, part of this is potentially negotiation. But at the end of the day, I think it's just critical to really have a clear view of what matters the most and how you're going to achieve that control, because that's sort of the red line or the bright line in that part of it. But this is interesting that I think the Trump administration is looking to have export controls potentially be a part of these, where historically they haven't been, because historically people said national security is not a trade issue,
right?
It's national security. And, especially in terms of the regimes, because most of our allies' legal authority to do their own export controls is fundamentally grounded in the multilateral export control regimes. Now, they've largely been able to move one step beyond that, and under their law, if they say, even if it's not a formal multilateral regime control, if enough other supplier governments are also restricting them, that's Russia, for example, and Russia restrictions, then they have the authority. But sort of the more you move down the unilateral path, or trying to get allies to agree and align with unilateral controls, then I think that becomes more challenging.
Yeah. Let's shift to impact, because a lot of the time when I talk about export controls to people, they'll ask the question, well, what's the impact, right? And my sense is it really is context specific. It depends on what goal you're after.
Yes.
And that is the determinant for, has it worked, has it not worked? And, there are different reasons. So tell us a little bit about how you think about this, and maybe give us some examples.
Sure. No, I think this underscores the importance of really thinking through, in any particular circumstance, what is the objective, right? And it can't be just, we're going to restrict, or, either on technology basis or a party basis. It's really, what exactly are we trying to achieve? Because then that not only makes sure that you calibrate the control correctly, you get the relevant allies on board, but also gives you something to measure against.
Yeah.
So to give you, I mentioned a couple examples in a sense already. The machine tool, where I think folks would say export controls were not particularly effective, and that had a negative impact on the U.S. tech leadership. And again, that's not just export controls, there are other factors. And the converse, the encryption controls. One very specific example that comes to mind is Syria. So for many years, probably 30 to 40 years, Syria had been designated from an export control viewpoint as a terrorist supporting country, and therefore subject to a very extensive set of restrictions. Not an embargo, but a very extensive set of restrictions for lower level tech. And then those controls were even ratcheted up further after Syria essentially invaded Lebanon, and there was a law passed, the Lebanese Sovereignty and Syria Accountability Act. And so at that point, the U.S. export controls to Syria were almost an embargo. Only food and medicine could go without a license. And then during the second Iraq War and the second Bush administration, there was a real problem with all these foreign fighters flowing in to Iraq to fight, attack U.S. troops through Syria. So there's a real priority for the administration to get the Syrians to close the border. Not surprisingly, the Syrians said, well, we'll think about it, but here's what we need from you. One was relief on some financial sanctions from the Treasury Department, and the other was to get replacement parts for their VIP aircraft, which were Dassault Falcons that Assad and his coterie would fly around the country in. And they were having trouble because they couldn't get the parts and components because they were controlled by us. So there was a very specific. And so to talk about context, you're right. The more, in a sense, targeted they are, the more likely they are to be effective. The broader they are, where you have foreign suppliers, the less likely they are to be effective.
So just sort of parting advice from you, if we were to look at the controls on AI chips for China, how should we think about the impact of export controls? Like, what are the indicators we should be looking for?
Well, so far, the policy goal seems to be to make sure that China doesn't get the capability to do the large language model training. So that's one way to measure. For example, based on what I've seen about DeepSeek, that's not a large language model. Now, that creates another issue, which is, are there AI applications less than that still have significant national security? The challenge there is that suggests you would broaden the controls. And then that drives you back to, okay, if they can't go to China where there's a significant market, is there sufficient market outside of China that is or could be developed or incentivized? So that's a piece of it. Another where I think, at least in the currently the controls have been effective is the public reporting on what's in the Huawei Ascend chip, which is their most advanced AI chip. Sort of the bad news, if you will, is they got some things that they shouldn't have. The good news is those weren't produced by Chinese fabs, right? So that would be, to me, an indication that at least the goal of keeping the Chinese fabs from being able to produce the most advanced chips so far has been successful.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That's a good tip for those of us who are trying to assess this going forward. Let me just go back to one other point. Russia controls. Were they effective? Are they effective? Give us some indicators about that.
Yeah, so that's another, I don't know, yes but or no but answer. I mean, heavily dependent upon foreign microelectronics. Everybody knew that, and that's the controls were, of course, among others, designed to get at that. The challenge we found is having the capability to really monitor the trade flows in real time, and then again take effective action either unilaterally or with allies, or particularly with countries that have not imposed those controls, because unfortunately a lot of those Western labeled chips, most of which are not made in the United States, are flowing through China to Russia, and the Chinese government has not indicated a willingness to put any significant controls on those. So that's another situation where you just need that analytical capability to see spikes in trade flows, figure out who the parties are, try to get at them through the actions that the Commerce Department has taken, and then get the other governments as much as possible to implement controls as well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it's clear that the controls have cost Russia more in dollars or cost as well as time, but unfortunately you still see those weapon systems, landing in Ukraine, and they have these at least Western labeled chips in them.
Yeah. And it's always good to keep in mind the counterfactual. So
Yes.
it may not have
Yes.
been 100% effective, but what would the counterfactual
Yes.
have been?
No, that-
is something that, as an evaluator of this, someone has to look at it from
Yes.
that perspective
That's
as
right.
well.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so here's like the big question for you on legacy, which is that you have led a team of phenomenal public servants with various types of expertise in BIS for many years. The challenge, the bar is being raised for them, and there is a question of how do you get your head around these numerous technologies that are advancing, not just AI, not
Right.
just quantum, life sciences, biotech, clean tech, all of these capabilities, and then undertake the full machinery of efforts that you have to undertake to implement export controls. What is your view when you look back on the team and what they need to deliver going forward? What would you say?
Yeah, well, I want to first say you're exactly right. I mean, all the progress that's been made and the success has been because of this phenomenal team, both at BIS, Commerce, the interagency, even the congressional support, industry, and foreign partners, and you need all this, and the think tanks as well.
Yeah. So the work of many hands.
Yes, and so you need within Commerce, particularly BIS, Bureau of Industry and Security, the individuals you have enough individuals who can pull all that together, and also the funding for the tools. There are all sorts of very sophisticated, data analytics tools, and in the Biden administration, I think there was a real significant step up in doing that, but I think still there's so much more that is needed, particularly because of all these accelerated emerging technologies and the global supply chains, and that a lot of this is not necessarily done only in the United States. That's really critical.
Yeah.
And then one other small point I'd make on this is one area where there was a very significant inflection point, and very, I think, underappreciated because it's really inside the Bureau. When I started, we had, of course, access to our export license application data. What was coming in, what do we prove tonight? But only about 50% of licenses are actually used. So we had a real inflection point, again, I think in the second Bush administration, because we were able to get some real expertise on the actual exports, which is something that Commerce as a department has access to. And so that was a huge inflection point. And it would seem very, nerdy or in the weeds, but huge important to know what's actually leaving the United States and where is it going.
Yeah.
The next inflection point is to know what's leaving third countries and where is it going.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think, more resources would certainly be beneficial for this, especially, as you said, as you've got these new technologies, and especially as you've got other countries that have key suppliers.
Just on that point, like, you must have had the challenge of attracting talented folks to BIS over the years, and now, given the sophistication of the enterprise, all the more important to continue to attract them. How did you go about doing that, and what would you advise going forward to your successors?
Yeah, I mean, it's casting a very wide net, and really reaching out to, of course, universities and other related institutions and think tanks, and explaining what the mission is. Because we've been fortunate that we've got people who are very dedicated to the mission. Almost by definition, you're going to make less money, but there's all sorts of opportunities. And I know that a lot of our staff, they're all regularly going and meeting with industry. They're regularly going to various bilateral or multilateral meetings, the kinds of things that you get a lot more responsibility a lot sooner. And if you're attracted to that, and a lot of people are, then that's the message to try to attract that talent. And then the challenge is, making sure that you can keep them, and then if positions open up, that you're able to fill them quickly.
Well, I'm hoping that the next gen who listens to this and hears your story and your experience will be motivated, excited, inspired to do that. This podcast is about betting on America, our technology advantage, our technology leadership. Could you leave us with some parting words on why export controls and strategic trade is an important part of betting on America?
Oh, absolutely. So it's really all we've been talking about, which is it's clear that we have to continually evaluate what technologies we need to keep from the adversaries and figure out how to do that effectively, which means they can't get it either from a U.S. source or a non-U.S. source, because that's the way you make sure that the U.S. companies that are the tech leaders stay at the tech leaders. So it's really not thinking of export controls, again, as a strategy, but as a tool and this full analysis of what are the collateral consequences of doing a control and making sure you've got them calibrated correctly.
Matt, thank you for sharing generously with your insights today. I'm a huge fan, and thank you so much for your service to the country over the years and your continued service in your new roles, including with CSIS.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us for this illuminating conversation with Matt Borman. You can find this episode and more on CSIS.org, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Navin Girishankar, reminding you everyone has a role to play in the tech race.